Hi, and welcome everybody. Thanks for joining us this evening. We have a really special discussion lined up. I'm Rosie Gibbs-Stevenson. I'm the curator at the Architecture Foundation. And today we are welcoming Lesley Lokko, who is a great friend of the AF and is also this year's recipient of the RIBA Annie Spink Award, which recognises excellence in architectural education. So I'm going to be handing over to Matthew Barac, who's a reader in architecture at the London Metropolitan University. And he is responsible for nominating Lesley for this award. So he is going to be chairing this evening, and he will introduce the incredible panel that we have as well. So handing over to you, Matthew. Thanks.
Thank you, Rosie, and thank you to everyone who's here already. I'm going to try to avoid looking at the number, which I can see already has gone up past 100 people, because I'll get stage fright, but it's fantastic to already see so many people here. I know people are coming from far and wide to join us this evening. This event is by choice the way we've organized it. It's not about speakers on a podium, it's a conversation. So I'm going to keep my introduction short, but I do have a few words to say. Firstly, why are we here? Well, we're here for Lesley, to talk about Lesley, but more emphatically to talk with Lesley about what she's done, what she's won, and what these ideas and these wins mean. And I say wins because not only has she won the RIBA Annie Spink Prize, which is, of course, an incredibly august prize, and we'll hear more about that in a moment. But she also, just 2 weeks after it was announced that she'd won the Annie Spink Prize, it was announced she'd won another one of the biggest international prizes available, which is the Ada Huxtable Prize. So it's a bit like winning an Oscar and then going directly to the BAFTAs and picking one up there. So it's extraordinary, and I'm sure you'll all join me in congratulating her. So you might wonder why I'm not here. We have this fantastic panel of women, and then we have me. So there must be a reason for me to be here, so I'll tell you a little bit about that. I was behind the nomination of Lesley for this award, and I'll give you a bit of a story about that, but let's just say that Andrew Clancy, who's a professor of architecture at Kingston, and I got together and talked about who to nominate, and for me it was only one choice, so I put forward the idea of Lesley, and then we contacted Zoe Berman, who's an old colleague and seemed to us to be very much someone we wanted to join our group. And the reason Lesley was on my radar was because I've known her for some considerable length of time, first through her work, then when I was working at the AR or connected to the AR as a member of the editorial board and also as the pedagogy correspondent for many years. I commissioned Lesley to do some writing for us, amongst a number of women I commissioned to do writing about architecture and education. And so I've known that side of her work for some time, but also as a member of the research group about African urbanism, organized by a superhero of African cities, Edgar Pieterse, who runs the African Centre for Cities at the University of Cape Town. And we developed this group who talked and met and worked together and eventually made some publications. So it's a kind of a scholarly and friendly relationship over some time. Now, I think one of the things that I wanted to share was the story of this nomination, because it was an incredibly rewarding process. When I joined forces with Zoe and Andrew, we started getting a dossier together, and we didn't quite know how much work it was going to be, because we had to contact all of these people in Lesley's extensive address book of former colleagues and students and ask them to submit letters of recommendation. And it was like opening the floodgates. So many people had so much amazing stuff to say. And I think this is one of the gifts, actually, of this prize. Even if you don't win, all of the other nominees, and of course I don't know who they are, must be left with these letters that tell a story, and it's really that story that I think is worth sharing, and I think we're going to hear a lot about it tonight. Suffice to say that we got a huge number of supporting letters. In the end, we had 6 letters from referees, which were quite detailed 2-page letters, some of them brilliant pieces of work, and then another 15 or 16 supporting letters, as well as a number of other supporting documents. So I should add that Lesley ended up seeing the whole of the dossier, which I think all the nominees do. So that's very much part of what you win. This nomination was built on our understanding of an individual who has practiced in the world in order to change and improve it. And she's done this without being, at the time that we all know about, without being reduced to a slogan or a mascot, and without losing her distinctiveness, and certainly not losing the Lesley I know, who is someone who knows how to be herself inside her own skin. When she picks up a pen, it's inside the skin of a writer. When she picks up a pencil, it's inside the skin of an architect and a designer. And when she looks in the mirror, she sees herself inside the skin of an educator and a leader. And when she goes out into the world, speaking the many languages that she speaks, because of her worldly and enthusiastic and engaged way of relating to and learning about the world, she's come to represent to a wider constituency, and that is all of us who are fatigued by misrepresentation and fake facts, a Black woman practicing and making change from inside her own skin. And people really identify with that. They love it. They love the realness. Like Lesley, I have a Jewish mother, and my mother would call this quality that Lesley has chutzpah. I've said it elsewhere, but she embodies for me this important quality of realness. She brings a sense of the real back into the room at a time when we're sick of the fake. And this is a sense of real issues, real values, and real character. So this event is about shedding light on those points of conversation which will arise from considering the way that Lesley practices and is in the world. And it's going to be a 360-degree conversation involving the various panel members who I'm now going to introduce. And they are Nicky Watson, Zoe Berman, Gugu Mthembu, and Thandi Loewenson. So I'll start with Zoe briefly, and then end with Nicky, who I will then hand over to make a brief statement before we go into questions. Zoe Berman founded design group Studio Berman to bring together a network of collaborators and architectural experts. Again, I've known Zoe for some time. She teaches at a number of schools of architecture and is a very vocal proponent of accessible and engaging approaches in design education, and an important campaigner for women in architecture. She's the founder of Part W, an action group of women working across the built environment for gender parity. We also have here tonight Gugu Mthembu, who is joining us from Johannesburg. Gugu is a young architect, performer, and gender activist. Her performance work entitled Embodiments has been published and performed internationally. Gugu is a graduate of the Graduate School of Architecture, or GSA, in Johannesburg, which was founded by Lesley. And her work argues for the right to present live work in place of a traditional thesis. And of course, Gugu was taught by Lesley, so she's here as a former student. Thandi Loewenson is an architectural designer and researcher who operates through design, fiction, and performance to interrogate our perceived and lived realms and to speculate on the possible worlds in our midst. And also in space, I think, from what I've seen recently of her work on Africans in space. Thandi is a tutor at the Royal College of Art, and she's a visiting professor at the Aarhus School of Architecture and a co-foundress of the architectural collective Break_line. And finally, Nicky Watson is here, also as a practicing architect and representing primarily the RIBA. Nicky is RIBA Board Trustee for Learning, and she chairs the RIBA Education Committee. So she's been very involved in this process from the RIBA perspective. She chaired the jury that selected Lesley for the RIBA Annie Spink Award. In her professional role as an architect, She is director of JDDK Architects in Newcastle, which is a medium-sized firm and practices all around the country, but primarily in that region. So I'm going to now hand over to Nicky to say a few words about the RIBA and her perspective leading up to today. Thank you, Nicky.
Thank you, Matthew. I hope everyone can hear me okay. Thank you for that. I'm really grateful to have been invited onto this panel this evening and have the opportunity to say a few words about the RIBA and about the Annie Spink Award. The RIBA, which its full name is the Royal Institute of British Architects, for those who may not be familiar with it, is a global professional membership body. It serves members and society in order to deliver better buildings and places, stronger communities and sustainable environments. As I say, we're a membership body. Our membership currently stands at about 50,000. And the two biggest groups of those members are practicing architects and also students. RIBA was founded in 1834 and was granted a royal charter in 1837. And its main objective in that charter being the advancement of architecture and the promotion of the acquirement of the knowledge of the arts and sciences connected therewith. And to further that objective, the RIBA undertakes a number of activities. We organise courses of instruction, award diplomas and certificates. We give RIBA validation to schools of architecture in 26 countries worldwide. And we care for one of the largest and most diverse architectural collections in the world, featuring over 4 million items. And that collection is can be accessed by the public for free. We receive and administer and apply donations, bequests and endowments for prizes and scholarships. And we undertake and execute charitable trusts, one of which is the Annie Spink Memorial Fund, which I'll just explain a little bit more in a moment. The first award that the RIBA ever gave was in 1836, and it was called the RIBA Silver Medal. And it very much was a celebration of architectural education and research. And showing the RIBA's continuing support for awarding innovation and excellence in education of architects, the Silver Medal continues to be awarded today and has found its contemporary place amongst a bronze medal, dissertation medal and research medals, which make up the RIBA President's Medals. The RIBA's programme of educational bursaries, scholarships and awards are invested and managed as restricted charitable funds that since 1836 have been built on by donations from trusts and foundations and from corporate partners and from individuals outside the profession who really appreciate the work of architects, but also by really generous members of the RIBA, such as Herbert William Spink. In 1967, upon his death, the estate of the architect Herbert Spink bequeathed the Annie Spink Memorial Fund to the RIBA, and it was to be treated as a lasting memorial to his first wife, Annie. And it was conceived as an honour for the advancement of architectural education. And over the years that followed its donation, it remained unspent for a period of time. And during that period, the fund benefited from financial investment and accrued significant interest, which allowed the RIBA in 2000 to award the inaugural RIBA Annie Spink Award for Excellence in Architectural Education. And it's continued since the year 2000 to be awarded on a biannual basis. And as you know, the reason we're here tonight is that in 2020, the award was made to Lesley. So the 2020 award, as we do every year, we receive a large number of nominations of a very high calibre. However, the members of the judging panel were unanimous in their decision to select Lesley as the recipient of the 2020 RIBA Annie Spink Award for Excellence in Architectural Education. A few thoughts about why they came to that decision. By imbuing the notion of identity into the understanding and debate of all things architecture, Lesley has enriched our discipline and our profession, making us all more aware of the diversity and plurality of voices, traditions and cultures of the individuals and communities that we, architects, serve. The innovation and passion in her teaching is matched by an unfaltering commitment to ensuring that architectural education and research run in parallel with the contemporary anthropological, artistic, technological and literary public debates in a process that ultimately questions, defines and enhances the position that architects play in society today and in the future. Sadly, Lesley has not received the trophy for her award at a ceremony at the RIBA yet, owing to the COVID-19 restrictions. However, we are delighted that our colleagues at the Architecture Foundation saw fit to celebrate this award in this format. And we do hope to be able to welcome you to a different event in not so distant future, where we can all gather in the same room and congratulate Lesley one more time. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm going to hand over to Lesley now to respond generally to what's been said so far.
In a strange way, I feel myself quite lost for words for someone who's a wordsmith. That's quite an unusual situation. It's straight off, it's amazing. It feels like in some ways only yesterday that I started out as a student thinking, dare I say something about race and architecture? Fast forward to 30 years. And to be able to look back at 30 years worth of talking and writing and designing and so on. But I want to say thank you, first and foremost to Matthew, Zoe and Andrew for the nomination, and to the RIBA for awarding it, and to everybody who wrote in support, and to everybody who's here this evening. It's quite something is the best way I can say I can respond to it. It really is something. Last year was, I think, my own personal annus horribilis. So this is an amazing way to start off 2021. So thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Lesley. I'm going to go over to Gugu, who I know has a question that might be quite close to this, but as someone who you know very well, I'm sure that it will spark some points of conversation, and we can just take it from there. Go ahead, Gugu.
Hello. Yeah, so I had a question that is very close to my heart, because as someone who's been taught by you, who's been led by you, who's been critiqued by you, for someone like me, this award comes very naturally, like it's a normal thing. It's almost, it doesn't come as a surprise. And it's not only because of the role you play in terms of representation. And by that, I mean, as a woman, as a Black woman, and because I was taught by you here as a Black woman in South Africa who led the Graduate School of Architecture. And not only that, not only the representation, but also the knowledge and the guidance that you bring and everything that you stand for. For someone like me, this award comes as a no-brainer. But it also then, I was also wondering, because I mean, being held to such a high regard must come with pressure, but that's why I was keen to know what this award means to you. Specifically, what does it mean to you personally? What does it mean to you professionally?
For better or worse, I think it's been quite hard for me to separate the professional and the personal. In some strange way, they're always so intertwined. But I keep thinking back to a conversation that I had with David Dunster, who passed away just over a year ago now. And I think I was in my second year at the Bartlett, and I kept hearing the word culture being sort of used. And I kept thinking, well, what people here talk of as culture is not really what I understand by it. So I need to do a little bit more investigation as to what people in the UK mean when they say culture. And I remember going up to him to his office somewhere on the second floor at the Bartlett and saying, I'd really like to do something about Black culture in architecture. Do you think that would be okay? And for those of you who know David Dunster, he took his cigar out of his mouth and he laughed and he sort of said, that's going to take you about 10 minutes. And then what are you going to do? And I was so stunned by the response, and it took me a while to realize that he was being ironic. And he reached behind him and he pulled out a copy of Third Text, which was a journal which is still published, and I still have that copy. And I realized that there was an entire world, and that the journal is about third world perspectives on art and culture. And I realized that there was an entire world behind me, in a sense, that had been looking at these questions, since forever. And what he was saying to me in a kind of roundabout way was, don't think you're so smart. I mean, there's a lot of thought that's already gone into this. And so in some senses, I still think of myself as that person 30 years ago, asking the same kinds of questions. And it's almost unbelievable to me. I mean, you call it a no-brainer. In a strange way, for me, this is a real surprise, because it seems as if for 30 years, those questions were being asked, but not really answered. So in some ways, the Black Lives Matter movement, I think, forced the topic on the table in a way that I think has never happened before. And somehow there is this 30 odd years, probably more, of people, not just myself, asking a whole range of questions. And suddenly when the moment erupted, the questions were there. So in some ways it's a shock. In other ways it's serendipitous, and in other ways it's completely fortuitous. So I have to say, I don't think of it as a no-brainer at all. I think of it as a combination of circumstances that in any other year might not have happened. And personally, I think the minute you think that you've asked all the questions is the minute that you stop. And for me, this really just feels like the beginning. So it feels like the beginning of being able to ask slightly different questions, maybe slightly deeper, maybe more critical questions, maybe less asking for permission to ask the questions, I think is the way I would describe it. Yeah. But not a no-brainer at all. Yeah.
Zoe, let's turn to you.
Thank you very much. And I am really interested in the gendered context of this award and of awards and representation and the valuing of the work of women more widely. And to contextualise my question a little, Part W as a group first met in late 2018, and one of the things that we talked about a lot was the way in which the work of women, the work of those from diverse backgrounds, the work of Black architects and of Black women has been consistently overlooked in traditional architectural structures. And this is exemplified when looking at the data of the international award systems, looking across at the Pritzker, the Japanese Premio Imperiale, and so on. The data shows that those awards through history have been given to just 3% women. And Sir David Adjaye is the first ever Black architect to have been awarded the Royal Gold Medal for Architecture. And Part W have, both publicly and behind the scenes, campaigned on this issue, and it's something I'm really passionate about. And so you, Lesley, as the youngest person to be awarded the Annie Spink and the second ever woman and the only person of colour to receive this accolade, thinking about that gendered context of awards and means of recognition, I'd really love to hear what for you is the significance of this accolade as a woman and in the context of gender.
Yeah, when I first started in leadership positions in schools, one of the first things I noticed had to do with labor. And it was to do with the way labor was both valued, but also expected. And I would say in the roughly, 15 years since that first leadership position, very little has changed. And one of the things that I felt very strongly about, also in my recent resignation, was the way in which the the kind of history and context of labour can never be separated from gender and can never be separated from race. Those two things they're intertwined. And it's been personally almost as difficult to know how to respond to that question of work, because most women, and certainly most women of colour, will go into any situation with the expectation placed generally on themselves by themselves that you will work harder, longer, faster in order to prove that you can be there. So in my own experience, I went into almost every position with my own Achilles heel. Now, I recognize that that Achilles heel was somehow of my own making. If you quizzed anybody in the room, I don't think that anybody would have said, no, I expect her to work harder, faster, longer. But irrespective, I placed that responsibility or that burden on myself. I think one of the real dangers about fulfilling that obligation to yourself is that you invariably lose sight of what it is that you came to do. All you do is work harder, faster, longer, stronger. And so you're at risk of losing whatever it is that's unique and special and authentic. You know, you're at risk of losing what you can bring to the table simply because you are literally working too hard. And you know, these questions around the relationship between work and value are so difficult to have, partly because they're always regarded as kind of ahistorical, acontextual, apolitical. And I would say for me, it's been one of the most challenging aspects of anything I've done, has literally been the cost of labor, the cost of work. I think, you know, there's a lot of talk around role models and what it means to see yourself reflected, you know, in positions of authority, in positions of leadership, in positions of excellence. I can say that I think the field is very, very different now than it was when I first started out as a student. You know, 25 years ago, you'd have been really hard pressed to think of more than one or two architects of color, let alone women architects of color. And I think that has radically changed. So in a sense, I do think change is absolutely possible. And in some ways, it's brought about by seeing others. So I think that the question of representation is never far from the surface, and I think it should never be overlooked. But the structural reasons as to why we're still talking about this 30, 40 years later, I think are much more difficult to get at, but are actually much more important. Yeah, it's a hard question.
But I mean, I think this is an important point, and it's worth teasing out. I had a pre-arranged sequence of people, but I'm just going to jump. Instead of going to Thandi now, I'm going to suggest we go to Nicky, because I think, Nicky, you were going to address something related to this. And I think, you know, what you're getting at here, this thorny question, especially the kind of responsibility you assume, and at the same time, against this kind of shifting field, is worth investigating a little more. Over to you, Nicky.
I mean, I was going to talk a little bit. I hope it's connected sufficiently, Matthew. I mean, I was going to ask you a little bit about I guess the varying experiences you've had across a number of different geographic and social and cultural contexts, and how your experiences in Africa, Europe, US, and Australia, perhaps how each of those contexts has shaped your thinking around issues of race and identity and gender. You know, if you had been in one place only, do you feel that you would have the same considerations as you do now, having had that experience across so many different contexts?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely not. I think, you know, race and gender operate very, very differently in different contexts around the world. I mean, you know, I've said this so many times, to speak in Ghana of being Black is ridiculous. I mean, everybody is Black, give or take. So there isn't a sense of being raced in that way. And I mean, luckily for me, in a sense, that was, you know, where I grew up. You know, race in South Africa, it takes on completely different dimensions. You know, everything is seen through the lens of race and to a certain extent gender. You know, America, it's a diasporic condition, very, very different to the UK. So I think having worked and lived in these different contexts for quite extended periods of time also makes you understand that that things are, number one, relational, you know, relative to the place that you are. But number two, and this for me was really a revelation in thinking about architecture, is that to be in multiple contexts, not necessarily simultaneously, but, you know, maybe sequentially, means you have to figure out how to translate the experience that you had previously into a new context. And so this constant act or necessity to translate, to figure out, okay, what are the codes here? What is the lens here? What is the history here? How do I respond to it? You know, in some ways, it's an incredibly architectural skill. You know, you build up a structure of how you are. You figure out what the phenomena are. You figure out what the codes are. My training as an architect, I think, absolutely helped me do that in these multiple locations. The other thing it brings, though, is a sense that the conditions are not permanent. You know, to come out of one society where gender, you know, to give a really concrete example, at some level, Ghana is quite matriarchal. You know, the figure of the very powerful woman is, you know, it's embedded, it's in our language, it's in our history, it's in our culture. So it's not as difficult as you might expect to be a strong woman. There's something already, or to be a strong Black woman, a strong African woman, it's already there. To take that experience and to work in a place like South Africa, you know, there are threads of it, but it operates very differently. To come to the UK, where class is the kind of mechanism through which everything is seen, maybe even before race and gender in a sense, gives another dimension to it. And I think architects are innate translators. You know, part of the training is the ability to translate something, an idea, into a drawing, or a drawing into a build, you know, on and on and on. And so in some ways, this was the right discipline to practice those kinds of experiences. And I came to architecture quite late. You know, I did other things before. And the sense when I kind of got to grips with what I was doing was I felt like I'd come home. That there was something very, very specific about the skills you needed as an architect that seemed to suit those contexts of constantly moving, you know, speaking different languages, being in different cultures, which is quite strange when you think about architecture. You know, its psyche is to root itself. It's to be stable. It's not to be unstable. But there was something very productively unstable about it as a profession. And you know, the flip side of that, I think, though, is that, and this I think is what happened to me in the US, is that you often imagine that the skills and tools and experiences you've picked up in one location will be useful in another. And I have to say, this last year, I read that wrong. What I had done in South Africa was of almost no use to me in the US. So it's both productive, but it can also be, I don't want to say destructive, but it can be less productive than you might, or than I imagined. Yeah.
Because it gives you a false sort of sense of security or confidence. You expect to be able to navigate the situation.
Yeah, and I think it gives you a false sense of confidence. I mean, one of the things coming out of South Africa for me was I thought to myself, look, this is the context in which it's not going to get any more heightened around issues of race and gender and power. Like this is going to be the apex. And boy, was I wrong. Yeah.
Thandi, let's bring you in here.
Thank you. I think actually I'm gonna pick up on a lot of the things that you've just been speaking about, Lesley, about these structural dynamics, right? And Gugu, I love that this is a no-brainer for you. It just gives me so much courage and confidence in the South African project, which I have to say I don't always have, but particularly in what you did through that school, Lesley. And I kind of want to come to that perhaps by speaking about a contradiction that I see in that change of context here, by speaking about something that happened about a week ago. We learned that the Home Office is building a new reporting centre in Newham. So this is a reporting centre for immigration and reporting, which comes with its own racist and gendered violence. But this is also a detention centre, which we know to be an inhumane space and a violation of human rights. And unusually for solidarity campaigning in this country, the focus was actually on the built environment, drawing people's attention to Turley Planning, who worked to secure planning permission for this site, to a design practice called IDEA, who in their Twitter bio claim to identify and enhance the connection between people and place. And to Turner and Townsend Project Management, who are, quote, making a difference in the world. And you speak about separating the personal and the professional, and like, frankly, seeing this play out within the architectural community made me feel deeply sick. But at the same time, I also really appreciated the barefacedness of it, you know, being able to see the complicity of the discipline really laid bare. And you speak about asking for permission. And I think one thing that's really amazing about the GSA is that this was this project that you really set up, right? And you were able to have the space to not ask for permission to an extent. And I'm really interested in how you dealt with that, particularly at the GSA. So dealing with that complicity of the profession and actually crafting a practice otherwise, a pedagogy otherwise, a space otherwise, where students like Gugu can come out and be unsurprised by this award. And I think one of the ways in which I saw this play out in the school was in the remarkable range of work that students were producing, really pushing this project that we call architecture in new, unusual, interesting terrains. And I think Gugu's example is a brilliant example of that, Gugu's work. So perhaps I could invite you to speak a bit more about this and how you navigated that through the GSA.
Yeah, I mean, you know, there were two things. One, I think the GSA would never have existed had it not been for the student protests in 2015 and 2016. So those political protests literally cracked open something. They cracked open a kind of space, and the University of Johannesburg just happened to be, or the Department of Architecture just happened to be in that space literally at the moment it cracked open. And I remember when I was asked to present the idea for the GSA to the faculty, so this was the Faculty of Design, Art, Design and Architecture. And I remember saying something about architecture's complicity with apartheid and saying, you know, the apartheid project could not have taken place without the tacit approval of the architectural profession. And I remember ending the speech in quite a prissy way, I think would be the right word, saying, shame on us if we don't have the courage to open up a different kind of space. Now, I could say that in South Africa in that context because the riots, the protests, all of the anger was spilling out onto the streets. And I knew that remark, shame on us, would hit a kind of emotional nerve. And it did, but it also got a lot of people's backs up. And in the subsequent, I don't know, year or 2 years, if the students hadn't been able to take hold of that space and start producing the kind of work that they did, And if the young tutors particularly hadn't picked up the baton, I think that school would have been over in a year, 18 months. But actually it was the courage, I think, of the students particularly, who saw something, who saw an opening, and they took it. And in a strange way, all the tutors, and when we used to say this over and over again, the students were ahead of the teaching. They knew before we knew what they wanted to do, what they wanted to say. There was such a hunger to experiment, to explore, to think through things differently, to work through different media. And I mean, I keep saying all we did was take a curriculum from the AA or Bartlett or wherever. We made almost no changes. We literally just plunked it down. But the students were ready for it. And that was a really profound lesson. And subsequently, I haven't found a similar group of students ready for change in that way. They took it and went in directions that I think none of us could have predicted.
I'm going to hand, I know that Gugu had a question which relates directly to this. So I'm going to hand over and we have another 20 minutes or so. So I think we'll just try to get through the remaining questions and then open it up after that to broader questions. Gugu, go right ahead. Yeah.
So just to carry on, like to continue what Thandi is already touching on and what you've already spoken on, Lesley, there seems to be like a lot of themes that have to do with intertwining, right? So the issue of the protests in South Africa that have to do with fees being too high, which is intertwined with issues of race, which is intertwined with issues of education for the Black child in South Africa. And similarly, how earlier on we've already touched on race and gender and how those two subjects are intertwined. And for me, all of those connections come down to intersectionality, right? Because all of us move through space and perform through space through a different lens, depending on your economic situation, depending on your gender, depending on your race, depending on what privilege you have, whether male or female, white or Black. All of these things are very, very political. And I find that when you start saying phrases like that, like Black woman architect or intersectionality or poor students who needs funding in South Africa, I don't know if it's just in my head, but there's a lot of shame that comes with claiming those titles, right? It's the same with the Black Lives Matter movement and the #MeToo movement. All of these things, like you said, like come together to create something. And I hear you talking about how with the GSA, it was the perfect moment of anger. It was the perfect moment of protest. And I just wonder if perhaps you think, what role did the protests from last year play towards this award, if any at all? If perhaps the Black Lives Matter movement or the #MeToo issues that speak to you played a role, and if so or not, is there anything wrong with that? Is there anything wrong with claiming that?
I mean, I'd have to say, of course they do. This was a really remarkable year in a sense. And for me, it would be disingenuous completely, I think, to say that that the timing of this is also not fortuitous. Isn't exactly the right word. I think things crystallize at different moments for different reasons. And I think what's for me really important is that the work has been there for a long time. I mean, I'm 57 now. I think I started this journey maybe 30 years ago. And that's a lifetime's worth of asking, of making work, of doing stuff. So yes, on the one hand, I think, yes, this year of all years, these issues are in the public consciousness, they're in the ether, they're in the air in ways that they probably weren't 2 years ago. but I also don't see anything wrong with it. I think that's the way change happens. And you know, we have an expression in Ghana, you know, people who've just arrived, we call them JJC, Johnny Just Come. Actually, I think it's a Nigerian phrase that we probably adopted. But I don't think of this as a Johnny Just Come moment. I actually think of this as something that's been burning for actually quite a long time. And, you know, when I first started writing fiction, I think might have been my agent or my editor at the time said to me, you know, we can throw as much money as we like at your books, as much marketing as you know, we can afford. But actually, word of mouth is what will push sales, and you know, almost nothing in marketing can better word of mouth. And I don't know that I would call the protest movements exactly word of mouth, but there is something that's been building for quite a long time that has slowly gathered momentum. And that momentum, yes, it's driven partly by media, but it's also driven by personal connections. It's driven by conversations. It's driven by discourses. I think last year that momentum reached a head, and now the really interesting thing will be to see not what, you know, it's going to be like this year or next year, but what's going to be, well, what will be in 5 years' time or in 10 years' time. And I think that's the amazing thing about education, is that it's a long game. You get into it and you're in it, not because of what's going to happen tomorrow or in 5 years' time, but actually in a generation. So it's a long-winded way of saying, yes, I think that the timing had something to do with it. And no, I'm not ashamed of the timing at all. Yeah.
Zoe, let's go to you.
Thank you. So I'm really curious about the title of this talk, as you know, Lesley, and honestly, cards on the table. When I received your and Matthew's incredibly generous invite to be part of this talk, and the title "Leaning In," I slightly went, "Oi." Oh, you know, because and we've sort of exchanged emails on this, that the Lean In title is so much associated with the title of the book by Sheryl Sandberg, Chief Executive of Facebook, paid just shy of £1 million a year. I really struggle with the Lean In manifesto, written from the point of view of a hugely wealthy white woman in a position of power, giving out pointers on how to pursue a career trajectory up and into a position of corporate dominance, and that is a very white kind of corporate dominance. And I thought, well, Lesley is going to have thought of this. I mean, Lesley knows that there's some kind of, I thought there must be some kind of mischief here, and I sort of sent you this this email, kind of nervously saying, well, I slightly have some concerns about, you know, about that title, but you know, there must be, there's so much more here that I think that that you want to explore, and that so many other layers of complexity and meaning that I think you are thinking of in this title, Leaning In. And so it would be lovely to hear what you mean by the title, what you think is interesting in this leaning in context.
So about 6 months ago, I had a really quite a powerful conversation with an African-American academic, female American academic. And I was saying to her that one of the things that really confused me in the past year was how close to white privilege many Black students I either talked with, or I didn't do any teaching this year, but you know, in conversation, I was very confused by that, because it seemed to me that the impetus from change would come from them. And she said, one of the things you have to understand about our context is that for 300 years, we have understood that when we make whites uncomfortable, our situation deteriorates. So we lean away from discomfort. And she used that phrase, lean away, and it immediately made me think of the phrase leaning in. And then I started to think about how phrases become co-opted. And there was a moment this summer where I had agreed to join with some of the students in the school, one of the protests in New York. And somebody, a very well-meaning, I would say a white liberal feminist, whatever, very kindly offered me a Black Lives Matter sign to hold up. And I thought, wow, so this is what it feels like to be co-opted. So I took the sign, put it in a dustbin, and left the march. And my attitude at the time, and I couldn't explain it, even to myself for a while, was I don't need someone to tell me my life matters. I don't need to be given permission to make it matter. And so I started to think about how these slogans, these phrases also become co-opted. And in a way I thought, okay, lean in has now become so synonymous with Sandberg. But actually this lean in and lean out that, you know, people in the diaspora, and I mean, in that context, I would say South Africa is also diasporic in that sense. This is a dance that we've been doing for 300 years. So for me, it wasn't really I knew that it would be seen in that context because it's become so synonymous with her. But for me, it pointed to a different kind of leaning in and leaning out. And it was about, you know, leaning into these movements, leaning into discomfort, leaning into protest in a way that is often, especially in positions of leadership, is often really difficult to do.
Do you want to come back on that at all, Zoe? I mean, I guess my only assumption is there's a cost presumably to that, and we yeah. I don't. Zoe, do you have anything you want to follow up with?
I think actually that was one of the things that was in my mind there, Matthew, of the cost, of the difficulty, and one of the things that springs to mind for me is the cost that is borne by those who are already experiencing forms of repression, having to carry the burden and the weight and pour the energy into dealing with those forms of suppression. And that is something that I think maybe comes back to a little bit ties in also what you were talking about in terms of labour, that it is those who are already marginalised who have to carry the weight of overcoming change. And that seems to be a consistent cycle, which actually one of the things that then I think maybe we might touch on just a little bit is also the role of men and the role of white men and the need to be making change together. Because I think this issue of repression often being addressed by those who are already struggling is a kind of a cycle that societally we seem to be struggling to break.
Yeah, I mean, I would say to the panel as well, if anybody on the panel wants to join in to respond to that, but I think absolutely, and it's, I mean, I call it this kind of, it's almost like a shadow dance, you know. You work, you push, you become exhausted, you give up, you step out, you come back, you push, you work again, you find new alliances, you find new allies. There's disappointment all around, you know, you fall out, you regroup, you come back. It's kind of endless. I mean, one of the things that really puzzled me when I first moved to South Africa, and I think this is only in the South African context that I felt this, that the impetus for change is everywhere. It's kind of understood. Something has to change. Very different conversation in the United States, also different conversation in the UK. And in those moments of extreme change in South Africa, when the going got tough, I always felt that the responsibility for navigating that toughness rested on those who wanted to change. Mm-hmm. And that was a very, very difficult space to occupy, because not only did you have to figure out how you felt about it, about, you know, the changes that were taking place and what needed to be done, X, Y, Z, but you also had to, or you were expected to accommodate the sentiments, emotions, responsibility of those who didn't want to do the work. So you wound up working almost 3 times as hard, but it was so clear that the responsibility for the change was yours. You want it, you figure out how to deal with it. And this, for me, both at an institutional level, but also at a personal level, was something that was very, very difficult to, it's very difficult to talk about, and also very difficult to quantify. And to a certain extent, actually, you know, if you are the person who's pushing for change, yes, you're the one who's going to have to keep on pushing. So it's a tricky one.
I'm going to, instead of following the pathway that I had set out, I'm just going to jump here to Thandi, because I think Thandi is going to address something that we can all perhaps then treat as the basis for a last contribution before we open it up. So Thandi, go ahead.
Yeah, I think I was actually might pivot slightly from what was planned, just in light of what's coming up. And I think I'm 1000% certain, Lesley, that we've spoken about this before, that this really famous Toni Morrison quote, right, that one of the functions of racism is that it's there to distract you, to keep you from doing your work, to exhaust you in the constant explaining over and over again your reason for being. And I think you've spoken about this kind of alchemy of conditions that led to the GSA being possible in the way that it was. And I'm conscious that in light of what's happened here and in light of the responses to that, of which this award is perhaps one of them in a brilliant way, there is perhaps a growing moment here, a growing kind of possibility of things to change in particular ways. But I'm conscious that we don't want to keep stuck in that space of, you know, constantly asserting presence, constantly asserting our reason for being, you know, constantly saying there are Black architects, there are Black women architects, or, you know, in the words of Outcast, the South got something to say. We want to take it past that and actually get to the nuance of the work that we want to do, and of the significance of this work. And perhaps building on that, I think one thing that I found so fascinating about your work is that you haven't done that you've constantly been pushing, and you see this so much at the GSA and the work that students are doing, is that they are developing a nuance of projects and a depth of projects that are exploring their identities, are exploring their moments, are contesting and confronting that. And I wonder how, I mean, I find it quite interesting that we're all grounded in this particular moment. And before everyone arrived, I was saying Lesley's the most mobile person I know in a pandemic, and I think that's something that's so much a feature about you, is that you're so in so many places and informed by so many places and engaging with so many conditions of what it means to be a Black woman architect. Could you speak a bit more about that, about the significance of being informed by all of these places to that work?
Yeah, I mean, you know, I thought I would be the last person ever to admit to this, but one of the most powerful things I've ever heard is a quote by an American motivational speaker called Stephen Covey. And the quote says something like, live out of your imagination, not just your history. And for me, it was such a wake-up call, in the sense that my history encompasses more than oppression. Yes, that is a part of it, and the labor of kind of explaining oneself and, you know, seeking the right to be X, Y, Z, those are parts of it, but it is by no means the sum. I feel very, very strongly that I am more than the sum total of my economic condition. So the ability or the hunger to look to multiple places as sources for work has always been like of the highest significance for me. And I think it's that ability that certainly the students, not just at the GSA, I mean, I'm seeing this in students in many, many places now, particularly in Black students, who are looking to all kinds of root material. And I think that the moment, and I saw this very, very strongly, maybe 3 or 4 years into the GSA, the moment that the work starts to speak for itself, it doesn't proclaim itself, it just is work that is informed by this history, is informed by these experiences, is informed by this language, is informed by all of these conditions, which, yes, you could say are race or African or other. But the minute the work has its own authenticity, it just becomes its work. And for me, that was the goal. And I would say after 30-something years, I know what that curriculum looks like. I've seen enough. I've experimented enough. I know how to put that thing together. Not just me, many people. We know what it's like now. So why we're not doing this? This is something of a mystery to me. Because we've been experimenting for a long time. So when schools are constantly asking me, can you come and sit on this board or sit on this panel and give advice here and talk, share, I'm like, no, the experiences are there, the work is there, you know how to do this,
Well, if they wanted advice or to get your opinion on something, they should have come tonight. And we don't have much time left, but I think we can perhaps spend another 5-10 minutes.
Sure.
A few people and some of your old some of your friends from far away, Lesley, are here and have started asking questions. I want to just go briefly through the questions, and perhaps you can pick up on any of the points as we go or afterwards, Lesley. First, Katie Marks, and then Mpeti Morojeli, and then Toki Brown, and then either James Thormod or Luthia from Mass. So, Katie, do you want to speak? If you unmute yourself, we should be able to see you.
Yeah. Hi. I just wanted to ask, following on from all that you've just said, I'd just really like to know more about your work and what you're doing now, what you're writing, and after all the experiences that you've had, and all the opportunities that will undoubtedly increase. I'm just interested to know, what is that work that's in your imagination, and where are you going to take it next?
So, I mean, the big project that's on the table at the moment is to start up an independent, not just a school, an Institute of Architecture back in Accra in Ghana, which is where I'm from. So that planning is, it's going along at a great pace. I mean, the pandemic has slightly altered, the physicality of it. But for me, that's the next and probably the last big project. And in some ways, I've spent most of my educational career outside Ghana dealing with race in a number of different contexts. For me, this is a real challenge now to go back home where race is not understood in the same way, to see, okay, this sort of transformational pedagogy that I've been thinking about for so long, how will this work in this new context? I'm teaching at the moment, which is always an incredibly healing place to go after administrating. So I'm teaching remotely in the States at two different, the Cooper Union and UVA, it's just started, it's fantastic. And writing a new novel. So there's lots kind of going on, but a little bit choppy, which I kind of like at the moment. So yeah, we'll see.
Let's see if Mpeti is still here and ready to ask his question. Last time I saw Mpeti was at a restaurant with you, Lesley.
Yes, the restaurateurs
Hi.
Sending text messages. Hi, Mpeti.
Hi, I wonder which restaurant that was. Hi, Lesley. Congratulations on your award. The second. Yeah, my question's there in the chat group.
Yeah. I mean, in what way do I think COVID has enriched or influenced reflections on space?
About race and space. I'm to understand what. That's it. Yeah.
So, I was in the States when, the pandemic first, in inverted commas, hit, or at least it hit the States. And I think one of the things that was so clear, within 2 or 3 months, was that you could no longer pretend as if race had nothing to do with the built environment and health. Those connections were made really strongly. So in a sense, the pandemic opened up something that I think African Americans had known all along, and it was now obvious. The other thing was that the pandemic forced everyone, I think, into quite a reflective state of mind. So certainly in the US, people were not as distracted, I think, as they normally are. And I think that was also one of the reasons why the reaction to George Floyd was so visceral, because people were, they had time to process something. So there was for me, there was quite a direct relationship between it. I mean, I think for me, it's too soon yet to process what this will mean for the way I think about these issues in a year or in 2 or 3 years' time. I'm kind of still digesting it, but I think it brought things together that a lot of, I think it was a convenient pretense to assume that they were not related, and I think the pandemic has really blown that apart.
Thanks. We had a message from Toki Brown. Would you like to ask your question?
Yes, thank you so much for what you said tonight, and congratulations on the award. You truly deserve it. I've been following you news-wise, and when you quit the job in the US, I was like, go girl, hit it hard. But but it was such an inspiration to just see a woman of color do that. That was for me very profound. And so I'm going to my question now. How can we use architecture to critically question cultural democracy? So shared values and heritages within these shared spaces. And normally what we see on the ground is these are contested realities within the built environment.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a great question, and thank you for it. I think at a very pragmatic level is to understand what the relationship between space and democracy is. One of my all-time, let me put it this way, one of the most profound examples I always think about is the Dogon people of Burkina Faso, which is the country just above Ghana. In their debating spaces in the village, you've probably seen them, these pillars that you find them now in kind of bougie stores where they stack CDs on them. They're like tree branches that have been kind of systematically chopped, and they're of a certain height, and they're of that height so that when the villagers are in the debating chamber, they don't jump up in anger. That the roofs of these spaces are quite low, and there's this relationship between the architecture that forces a kind of behavior. I think in so many places we've completely lost that understanding of the relationship between behavior and space, and so we take it for granted that that spaces are somehow innocent, that they are sort of empty of certain values. I think particularly for lay people, and so one of the things that I'm always talking about especially with Black students is how space comes to shape behavior, and I think it's, architects often do a really bad job of explaining what it is that we do. Our language is quite convoluted. And I think I try as much as possible to be really explicit about those kinds of relationships. It's a big question.
So I think we probably have time for one more question. As I know, Lesley, you have to go and prepare to give a class in America in about 20 minutes. So we're going to just end with one. We have James Thormod and Luthia Medina here from MAS. MAS is the Metropolitan Architecture Student Society, which is the London Met Student Society. And last year, in response to the kind of the wider protests, and perhaps as a local response also in solidarity to some of the Roads Must Fall and similar protests, from our students, we've all been under pressure up and down the country to rethink aspects of our curriculum. And these two, with their team, produced a document called Conversations About Racism. So I'm hoping they're going to address some of those issues. James, Luthia, do you want to unmute yourselves and address your question to Lesley?
Hello, thank you, Matthew, for that introduction. Yeah, I've been really inspired by you for a while, Lesley Lokko, and that was first really kicked off from the new Architecture Writers Programme, which was a brilliant talk on the power versus Palladio. And I was particularly taken by your point that to be angry is just one step. It's just really the first step. And really this whole talk has touched on this, but what is your advice to a student group as we are that is trying to move from progress to institutional change? I think protest is something which is almost the sort of easy or first part. It's the hard work which then kind of begins, and just your advice there.
I mean, I think I've got audio loop. Can you hear me 3 times over? Because I can hear myself. Okay. You know, I think there are 2 things, and I always, it's a slightly odd example, but what Edward Enninful has done with British Vogue for me is a really interesting model. And that is to say that change comes from both top down and bottom up. And I don't mean it in exactly the way I think, you know, hierarchy and grassroots. But what he does, which is really clever, is he puts in infrastructural change within the magazine. So in terms of, you know, who's writing, who's editing, who's being heard, who's commissioning. And then what I would call creative change in terms of what do you see, what's the representation, what's the visual language like, what is the nuance, what is the vibe. It's a very interesting dynamic. So it's kind of change in 2 directions at once. And I think for protest groups, it's very easy to get caught up in only the protest, which is in the demands for change, and to find less space, time, and voice for the way in which things might change. So it's this kind of dual act of making sure that the work, whatever the work is, what are you working on, is speaking to change. At the same time, you're demanding structural change, and those 2 things are not always the same. So it's to embed the demand for change in as many layers as possible. I think protests can be one directional, which is you shouting, someone resisting, you shouting, someone resisting. And sometimes, yes, you know, they give, but the actual work itself is often where the change is more lasting.
Fantastic. Lesley, thank you so much for that. And thank you all for coming. I'm exchanging signals with Rosie that we're ready to close now. I'm going to have the last word, if that's all right. Just to say that once again, thank you all for being here. Thank you to Lesley for being such an inspiration to all of us and getting this great audience together. I also just want to mention, I see Sarah Wigglesworth is in the audience. Sarah is speaking on Thursday. Sarah has been another extremely important educator in my career, and she's speaking at the Architecture Foundation on Thursday, so do come along for that. Thank you all very much from me, Matthew Barac, and from Lesley, Thandi.
Thank you, everyone, and thanks Matthew and the whole panel for